Hi, Phil. Nice to see you
Hi,
again.
Phil. Nice to
So,
see you.
for those of you who are joining us, I am so excited to get Phil to come and speak with us. I feel like all of this work has Phil's fingerprints all over it, and he can speak to the ecosystem like nobody else. I I think we're going to go really hard in the paint on some of the tech aspects of this. However, for those of you who feel uncomfortable with getting too technical, I assure you, Phil knows how to help people land gently in this work. It's really about trust. So, one of the things I wanted to start off with you, Phil, is really to talk about trust and trust within this idea of an ecosystem, which I know you have mentioned is really a triangle. So, I know we have a video. Do we want to try and tee that up so we can start with that for people?
Sure. So let me share my screen briefly. And I think that's it. And why don't I just give it a shot? So this is actually a video that came out of the T3, the T3 Innovation Network of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which many of us are involved in. And it is just a general introduction to what the LER is. And the term LER has emerged as a catch-all, if you will, for the kinds of digital records that Nate was describing in terms of badging and single assertion records, as well as those that are relevant coming from the employer's HR system side. So let me just play this video, assuming that we can get it to work.
Every person's career path is different, and keeping track of the sum of our experience can be difficult. Resumes and education transcripts help, but keeping them up to date, accurate, and verifiable is a constant challenge for students, workers, and job seekers. What we need is something like a digital passport, where all of our learning and skills can be brought together in one easily accessible place. That's where LERs come in. An LER, or Learning and Employment Record, is a comprehensive digital record of skills and competencies learned in school, on the job, through volunteer experiences, or in the military. It includes credentials, diplomas, and even employment history. And when all your LERs are combined, it can help you identify training opportunities, explore career paths, and even apply for jobs. Pilot programs for LERs, supported by the T3 Innovation Network, are already underway across the globe. Learn how you can join this movement.
And there we go. So let me stop that at the moment. And that's sort of a general introduction to the space. The important thing, I think, is the recognition that employers will be issuing credentials with respect to the way and the things that workers are learning on the job, or in more formal sessions that the employers make available to them. And that these records also incorporate the kinds of HR records that encapsulate things like salary history or position history and things like that.
So, do you want to explain a little bit about the trust triangle? I love, we say ecosystem a lot in this space without a lot of definition to it. It's sort of like this jazz hands kind of hand waving thing where it's just out there, these things are going to work. I think the rubber really hits the road in the work that you do. And it's very, to me, it's very much about just webifying the credentials, but making them useful and the value proposition actually works. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit about how you're using the word ecosystem and this in particular, this trust triangle.
Well, so many of you have heard this phrase, and I'll just put the phrase, the image up. It's on the right-hand side of the screen. The trust triangle comes out of the Trust Over IP Foundation, and it really was an intention to try to raise the individual as a holder, as in this particular depiction of it, as an equal player in the exchange of credentialing information. So issuers like institutions like ASU and others issue credentials to recognize the achievement of accomplishments of one sort or another. They may issue them as single assertions, as in badges. They may issue them as part of a transcript or what have you. They get sent over to the holder, that is the individual, the person that is the subject of those credentials, in a sense, the person that earned them. And then it's in the holder's curation and management responsibilities in using their wallet, like Pocket, to be able to selectively send some or all of them to what's referred to on the right side as the verifier, which is the recipient. It could be an employer, it could be an organization that the individual is applying to for further training, things of that sort. Beneath all of this, and what distinguishes it from the stage we were at before, is this verifiable data registry, a place to hold the keys that are used to encrypt the messages that allow them to be tamper evident and allow the holder to have the exercise of agency around how they can move and aggregate things around without any fear that the recipients of these things will have the possibility of that holder modifying them while they were carried in their possession. So the trust triangle is sort of the verifiable credential framework, and there are components, wallets for the holders, issuing platforms for the issuers, verifying tools for the verifiers' employers, and infrastructure beyond that in terms of where these credential keys are stored, protocols that define how the information moves from point A to point B, and things like that. That's the sort of the scope of that ecosystem.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I feel like is starting to show up in conversations about emerging credentials is this idea of the holder, the agency around the holder, around the individual. And it seems like it's aligned with the self-sovereign identity, the decentralized trust. Earlier today, when I was talking about distributed trust. And I think you can see in this trust triangle that there's something really interesting happening around us as individuals and the kind of ownership that we have. So do you want to say a little bit more about the holder and what that means in this new model? What would be different than what we experience now?
Right. Well, I mean, this is the sort of the real value of some of the cryptographic signing methods that have emerged in the last 6-7 years. The whole reason why in the past an individual called the registrar's office of the institution they were at and said, would you please send a set of my transcripts to the following locations? Or perhaps you said it via emails. But in any event, you had to go to the source of that set of achievements that you earned, because you as an individual were not trusted. You were not trusted. It was obvious when you requested a copy of your own transcripts, because right across the front of it, it says unofficial copy. Well, it's an unofficial copy because it's in your possession. It's no longer trusted or trustable by a third party. A little bit of work with a good editing tool, and you can make your transcript into anything you want. So the ability to have signed this thing in a cryptographic way allows the holder now to have confidence in the authenticity of what they send to somebody else, where that authenticity is guaranteed by that signature, that the holder hasn't modified anything in the package that the issuer initially gave them, however long they might have had it in their possession. And that's been the change. That's what's elevated the individual to be able to now play the role to curate the materials that they have that describe themselves and put them into different stacks, if you choose that metaphor, or collections that describe attributes that they want to have presented to a third party that is really trying to show their best self with digital data to back it up.
Yeah, I think this is one of the really exciting parts about the emerging credentials conversation. And I like that ASU chose emerging credentials without focusing on digital credentials or micro credentials or anything like that. Because as you can see in that trust triangle, we're really talking about all credentials. This model is becoming relevant for all credentials. Do you want to share the slide? I think that slide that you have is going to show a nice tie-in between Nate, who we just heard talking about the next 10 years of badges, as well as some of the conversations we were having earlier in the day about the emergence of this work. I think this slide does a really nice job of showing people both the complexity and also a little bit of a simplification of what this looks like from a high elevation. Do you want to walk us through a little bit about what's going on in this slide?
Sure. Let me see if I can get this out. Hang on one second, because I want to get this out of the way so I can show it in its glorious detail here. Get that up there and then go down and present it. There we go. So what this is trying to do is from right to left, showing sort of the evolution of the credentialing world from the vast bulk of credentials that are out there in non-digital formats, paper essentially, of which there are millions of people with credentials, either transcripts or certifications or licenses, or a dissertation could be your credential for certain particular needs. And then it evolved and moved into something that was digital, but the digital was really a digital representation of paper in the context of PDFs, for example, or document files, docx files, or just the images themselves, pictures of the credentials that you had that were certificates. We then moved into the notion of turning this from a digital representation to something that was more computationally consumable. And that's where we moving to data models to hold this information, JSON and JSON-LD being the contemporary ones at the moment, but XML is popular in other parts of the world. And this is where badging, like in Badger up to version 2.x, is a full player in this particular space, as is the CLR1, the comprehensive learner record from IMS, which tried to make a compound document out of badges and transcripts and competencies, for example. More recently, we moved towards this hybrid that Randa Solutions and Marty Reed and his team built with something called Open Credential Publisher, which is allowing the packaging of the CLR v1 into something that can act like a member of the verifiable credential world and that ecosystem. So that was a valuable, and at the time, the only mechanism by which to bring CLRs, the comprehensive learner records, into this verifiable credential ecosystem. But now that we're getting close to having things like the badge that Nate referred to earlier in the OBV3 incarnation of it as a full-fledged member of this ecosystem, which takes advantage of the cryptography we're talking about before. It has a data model with a relatively rich representation of different types of objects that can be in there. Referencing your comment earlier about credentials can be many things. Credentials can be representative assertions about learning. They can be anything from simply a representative credential that says your age or your age range, or it could be something entirely different. There are credentials that are associated with the packaging and movement of materials from point A to point B in the supply chain, for example. All of this then, in this particular case, is basically a combination of data models that represent the kinds of material and information that is put together in the package, and protocols, the rules by which those things are exchanged from one to another. One of the more confusing ones is the verifiable presentation, which sounds like it's a package that has things with a UI, UX associated with it, when in fact it's actually representing the method by which a verifiable credential is moved from point A to point B, and the verification that the sender is who they claim to be, and then the result is you end up with a stack of individual verifiable credentials in the hands of the relying party. And the only thing we know about the future beyond the prognostication that that Nate was giving us just a bit ago is it's likely to include things like quantum cryptography to get around the more determinist approaches that cryptographic methods have used to date. And of course, the arms race about that sort of thing will continue. But exactly where it goes from there, we don't really know. The only thing we do know is that there will be an increasing number of employers that will see the value of these kinds of credentials, and which will likely, with their own HRS systems, generate credentials that represent the things that an individual may have learned on the job or other attributes of their work that can be added to an individual's wallet in a verified way with the signatures associated with that, so they can be presented for the procurement of services that individual might need from government agencies. The most obvious one that is a pilot that's kicked off so far is associated with unemployment insurance. That is, you were a worker, you're now unemployed, you wish to apply for unemployment insurance, and in that process, You have to demonstrate your prior wage history and your prior position history. That in the past required the government agency to go back to your employers to confirm all of that. Now, with these signed credentials, that is confirmable with a click, and that time lag can diminish, and the processing of that request can be dramatically shortened. And so that's one of the ways in which this kind of credentialing environment extends to a broader category of services.
I'm seeing a lot of questions in chat about blockchain, and I know from my colleagues who talk about OBB3 and CLR2 and other parts of the digital credential ecosystem that it is almost impossible to have this conversation without mentioning blockchain. So do you want to, I have sort of a it looks like a multi-pronged question, but do you want to just address blanketly, sort of in a blanket way, the way you see blockchain interacting with some of these different ideas?
So blockchains are one of the ways that keys can be stored that are used in the credential verification process or the credential proofing process. The traditional database can be used in the same way, and many of you have probably heard about, and I'm not sure if it's been presented this morning or not, but the Digital Credential Consortium led by MIT has been doing their pilot. Their key storage is using a key repository that is a database. And the consortium of institutions that are involved put their keys in there so that they can be accessed. So there are multiple ways by which keys can be managed. And blockchains, of course, is one. And there are flavors of blockchains at this point proliferating left and right. The one thing that I think everybody is trying to steer clear of, at least many of us are trying to steer clear of, are those that require things like proof of work for the committing of the records to the blockchain, simply because of the environmental characteristics that are associated with that. But the reality is that they're not necessary in this environment. They are an option.
Yeah, if I'm not misunderstanding it, it seems to me like it's the cryptography that matters. It's that layer of trust that allows for, I always think of ownership as really about delegation. Would you say that that's an accurate word to use?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point, because we tend to use the metaphors that we're familiar with, and the metaphors that we're familiar with are typically associated with physical things. And ownership is one of those, where we tend to associate ownership in the same way that we own a book, or we own property, or we own a car. And what are the things that ownership entitles us to? In this particular context, it's a little bit nuanced, because in reality, when you're issued a credential from ASU, for example, for a certificate that you've earned, and they've instantiated that in the context of a badge, for example, ASU still owns the responsibility of the authenticity of that data, and it's in your care as a credential that you have in your wallet that you can curate and choose to stack with others and send to whomever you wish, whenever you wish. But you don't own it. And that's important, because there is this need to ensure that the credential you have is exactly an authentic replication of the one that ASU gave him. And that's got to be the thing that is retained. And also that if for whatever reason ASU decides that credential shouldn't be issued to you anymore, they have the opportunity to revoke it or expire it. And the expiry part is a very common use for credentials for which, for example, the allied health and medical areas require renewal of a license periodically that might be issued as a credential. So the ownership notion is not completely useful in this context. That's why we tend to think of the possession of credentials by the holder as curating, managing, arranging, sending, those kinds of operational behaviors which are expressed in the management and the processing of a credential, the presentation of self with that credential, but not ownership, because ownership conveys meanings that in this particular case aren't quite applicable.
Yeah, I think that's a really important part of this conversation that it's helpful to hear you frame it that way. One thing that I am thinking myself as I read this is sort of watching the chat, and there's a discussion that I think is going to be evergreen about trade-offs. And one of the things that I think, and I know this is a buzzword and everybody defines this in a different way, but there is a Web3 conversation happening here.
Yep.
Do you want to talk about that a little bit in terms of Ed3, how this applies to the earn to learn ecosystem or the trust triangle? What are the salient pieces of the trust triangle or of Ed3 that we should be watching for and listening for and reading about in the years to come?
So the Web3 space, to a large extent, has the huge shadow of cryptocurrency over it, and DeFi, decentralized finance, and those things are, in my mind, less relevant in many ways to the overall ecosystem of verifiable credentials. Where there are potential interesting uses, there are some examples that have been done where they have used fungible tokens in an environment in order to incentivize participation in whatever activities that the system was providing. And the one that comes to mind that some of you are familiar with is the World Bank project with Evoke, which was a gamified sort of learning experience, a set of pathways in a learning experience developed to try to increase retention in middle schools in Colombia. And the sort of the original motivation for it was that there were high dropout rates in middle school going into high school, and what could be done to try to retain that. There's lots of pressures on the students and the families in Colombia to contribute more economically to work, or to be less of a burden economically to the families, and all of those things were resulting in high withdrawal rates. And so this Evoke environment, which was based on a blockchain, which did use fungible tokens to reward individuals for the achievements along the pathways that the learning journeys had followed, could be taken to a marketplace that they built in the game, in the learning environment, which could be exchanged for cell phone minutes. Telefonica in Colombia was providing an exchange for X number of tokens to X number of cell phone minutes. And that was, as it turned out, a tremendous motivator for the kids involved in this. And they had significant increases in retention as a result. So in that sense, I think there's potential value for extrinsic motivations. There's also potential value for the use of smart contracts. So that as Nate was talking about earlier, where you need to transact various things at volume or with speed in a large environment, smart contracts become an interesting way in which that can be mediated. So I think those are important. I'm less enamored of some of the other uses of it. I know the NFTs are a great craze at the moment. NFTs being tokens that are unique as opposed to fungible. A fungible token has exactly the same value and composition, if you will, wherever it is, whereas an NFT is a unique thing. Every single one is distinct. I can see it in markets where there's an attempt to do digital art, and I can see it as mechanisms to be used in other contexts where there are graphic objects that might even have value as being co-shared or co-owned by a large number of people. But I'm still trying to search for where the NFT has a real value in the learning context. It's not to me obvious, and there are lots of concerns that once again that we're using types of blockchains which are not necessarily as helpful to the environment as they could be, and much more aligned with some of the projects that have basically hybridized between graph database environments and blockchains. And I know the ASU is looking at Flurry, for example, in the context of things to some of the projects it's doing. That's one of those that is basically a graph database with a blockchain to hold the things that you want immutable.
I think that's a great place to wrap. I think we need to move on to our next part of the session. The one thing I did want to say is if this felt intimidating or exciting, regardless of how it felt, is just to make people aware that there is a whole other track of thinking going into the data models, these trust triangles that are separate from the conversations about assessment and trust and some of the human practices that go on the micro-credential side. And they really belong together. If you're going to ever have a summit or a conference or anything, these two do dovetail together. So thank you, Phil, for wrapping those in together so nicely. I think you've got a nice, deep knowledge on both sides of those. So it's nice to find that in one person. Thank you for having the conversation with me. And thank you, Stephanie, for inviting us to come and talk about this.